Alec Stanton had no idea what to do with a cabin that smelled like pine and looked like it hadn't been lived in since the 90s. He stood in the middle of the creaky wooden floor, snow melting off his leather boots, a designer coat completely out of place in the rustic space. The lawyer hadn't been kidding. His late uncle's cabin in Aspen Ridge was every bit the backwoods time capsule he described. There was no Wi-Fi, the stove looked like it ran on prayers, and the furniture looked like it had been dragged here during the Carter administration. Alec exhaled, rubbing his jaw. What the hell am I supposed to do with this? He didn't need the cabin. He had 3 penthouses in New York, a summer estate in the Hamptons, and a black card that could buy half this town. But the will was clear: keep the cabin for 1 year or forfeit the land. And that land, from what his financial advisor said, sat on some very valuable timber and development potential. He wasn't about to let sentiment or a few logs stand in the way of a smart investment. Just as he turned toward the door, it flew open. A woman walked in like she owned the place. She was holding a bundle of firewood in her arms, cheeks flushed from the cold, a knit beanie tugged over a mess of dark curls. "Whoa, sorry," she said, startled. "You're not Joe." "No," Alec said carefully, eyeing the firewood. "Definitely not Joe." She blinked at him. "You must be Alec, the fancy nephew." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that what they're calling me?" She shrugged, stepping inside like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Joe used to let me drop off firewood every week. He liked to pretend he could chop it, but we both knew he couldn't swing an axe to save his life." Alec watched as she set the wood down by the stone hearth, dusting her hands off on her jeans. She was warm and alive in a way that made the whole cabin feel less dead. "I'm Gwen," she added, glancing up. "I live next door." "There's a next door?" he asked, walking to the window. She pointed through the frosted glass. Sure enough, there was a smaller A-frame tucked into the trees, smoke curling from the chimney. "I thought this place was miles from civilization." "Just about." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're staying?" "For now," he said. 1 year. She nodded like that meant something. "Don't worry. You'll adjust. Everyone does." "I'm not everyone." "No," she said, grinning. "You're wearing boots that cost more than my truck." He didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. But for some reason, her teasing didn't bother him. "Thanks for the firewood," he said. "But I can take it from here." "Right," she said, brushing a curl back from her cheek. "Just came by to help. Joe was good to me." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving the scent of snow and pine behind her. Alec stared after her, then back at the firewood. He didn't even own gloves. The next morning, he woke to the sound of knocking. Loud, persistent knocking. He opened the door to find Gwen standing there again, this time holding a thermos. "Coffee," she said. "You're gonna need it." He took it, surprised. "You always show up like this?" "Only when rich city guys move in next door and look like they've never lit a fire in their life. I can figure it out." She looked past him. "Is that a smoke alarm I hear?" He turned. Smoke was curling from the fireplace, not exactly going up the chimney. "Okay," he admitted. "Maybe I need a little help." She stepped inside again without asking and moved straight to the hearth. "You stuffed it too tight. Gotta let it breathe." She knelt, hands moving with practiced ease. A few minutes later, the fire was burning clean and strong. "Impressed?" she asked, standing. "Actually, yeah." She smiled for real this time, and something in Alec's chest shifted. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Let me guess. You thought I'd be a 60-year-old man with a beard and a shotgun." That was option 1. Option 2 was a hermit who talks to squirrels. She laughed. "You'll meet him. He lives 2 miles up the ridge." Alec chuckled, then took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, strong, and surprisingly good. "You make this?" "Of course." He took another sip. "What else do you make?" She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I was planning to eat protein bars and instant noodles for the next 11 months. She rolled her eyes. "You're hopeless." "Hopeless. But rich," he said, grinning. She gave him a look, but it was playful. "That's not gonna help you much out here." "We'll see." That afternoon, Alec found himself chopping wood. Badly. Gwen had dropped off a spare axe after lunch, along with clear instructions. He'd laughed her off, then realized she was right. The firewood wouldn't last forever. By the time the sun set, he was sweating under 3 layers, sore in places he didn't know existed, and had successfully chopped maybe 6 logs. He was about to give up when Gwen reappeared, this time with her own axe slung over her shoulder. "Need help?" He didn't answer. She just walked over and started swinging, clean and fast, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Which, apparently, she had. "You do this every day?" he asked, watching her. "Pretty much. You could start a Firewood empire." She grinned. "I prefer the quiet." He watched her for a second too long, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. "Why do you live out here anyway?" he asked. She paused, wiping her brow. "Because it's real. Out here, things matter. You chop wood or you freeze. You take care of people or they're alone. There's no pretending." Alec nodded slowly. "I think I needed to hear that." She looked up at him, eyes softening. "Maybe you needed this place more than you thought." That night, Alec sat by the fire she'd helped him build, sipping her coffee, staring at the flames. The cabin wasn't just old wood and dust anymore. It was quiet and warm. Alive. And he couldn't stop thinking about the woman next door with fire in her eyes and strength in her arms. He came here for land. But now he wasn't so sure that's what he'd found. The snow had fallen heavier overnight, blanketing the ridge in silence so thick Alec could hear it when he stepped outside. Snowflakes clung to the collar of his coat as he stood on the porch, steaming mug in hand, watching the sun rise over the treetops. It was the kind of morning that made noise feel like a crime. He hadn't planned to stay in Aspen Ridge for more than a few days, maybe a week at most. But 3 weeks had passed and he still hadn't called the contractor to start the development survey. Every time he picked up the phone, something in him stalled. Across the narrow trail that separated the two cabins, smoke rose from Gwen's chimney. He hadn't seen her the day before, and though he hadn't meant to notice, her absence had made the silence feel heavier. He caught himself halfway through wondering what she might be doing and shut it down fast. He hadn't come here to get entangled with anyone, especially not someone like her, practical, self-sufficient, deeply rooted in a place he still considered temporary. But that didn't stop him from heading over anyway. He knocked once and waited. She opened the door wearing a paint-smeared sweatshirt, strands of hair escaping the braid down her back. "I was starting to think you'd disappeared," Alec said. "I was painting," she replied, stepping aside. "Come in before you freeze." He hesitated at the threshold. "You sure?" She gave a small nod. "You brought me cookies last time. I figure that buys you at least one unannounced visit." He stepped inside, surprised by the warmth. The cabin was smaller than his, but cozier, filled with color and life. The walls were lined with canvases, some finished, some half-done, all of them vibrant, wild, and breathtaking. "You paint," he said, staring at a large canvas leaning against the wall. "Only when I can't sleep," she said, picking up a rag to wipe her hands. "Which is often." He moved toward the largest, painting a riot of reds and deep blues, trees bending in a wind that didn't exist except on canvas. "This is incredible. You sound surprised." "I am," he admitted. "You never said you were an artist. You never asked." "I guess I thought." He trailed off. She glanced over, one eyebrow lifted. "Thought what?" "That people who chop wood and fix chimneys don't also make art that looks like it belongs in a gallery. People contain multitudes, Alec." He looked at her, then really looked. There was paint on her collarbone and something tired in the way she held her shoulders. "What keeps you up?" he asked, quieter now. She hesitated, then turned back to the canvas. "Some nights it's the past. Some nights it's the future. Most nights it's both." He didn't know what to say to that, so he looked at the painting again. "You should show these." "I do sometimes. There's a gallery in Boulder that takes a few pieces a year. You ever think about doing it full-time?" She laughed, not unkindly. "You mean leave all this glamour behind?" He smiled despite himself. "I meant it. You're good." Her gaze softened just a little. "Thanks." They sat for a while without speaking, the only sound the crackle of her wood stove. It wasn't awkward, just quiet. Eventually, she asked, "What did you used to do before the cabin?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Investment strategy. Mergers. I ran a firm in Manhattan." "Sounds exhausting." "It was." "You walk away, or were you pushed?" He glanced at her, surprised by the bluntness. "But he liked it." "I walked." Sold my shares, boxed up my suits, and told myself I needed a break. And now you're here. Now I'm here. She nodded. What's the endgame? He didn't answer right away. I thought I knew. I thought I'd flip the land, double its value, and be on a plane back to the city before spring. And now? He looked at her and something shifted. Now I'm not so sure. She didn't press. Instead, she stood and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned with a plate. Try this, she said, setting it in front of him. He picked up a fork and took a bite. It was a savory pie, mushroom, onion, herbs he couldn't name, but it melted in his mouth. You made this. I trade them for eggs from Mrs. Jensen down the ridge. He took another bite. You live off barter? Mostly. Money's tight. I freelance when I can paint commissions, teach a few classes in town. He looked at her with new eyes. You're resourceful. I'm surviving. I think you're doing more than that. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. You're not what I expected either. What did you expect? Someone who'd complain about the cold and try to bulldoze the ridge by week 2. I still might. But you haven't. They locked eyes for a moment too long, and Alec's heartbeat shifted, subtle but undeniable. He stood, needing to move. I should get back. I left water boiling. Is that code for something? Unfortunately not. She walked him to the door. As he stepped outside, she called after him. Alec? He turned. I'm glad you stayed past week 2. He didn't answer, just nodded once and walked into the snow. That night, he didn't light a fire. He didn't need it. The first real thaw arrived with a whisper, not a bang, just a subtle change in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. The snow on Alec's roof slid off in heavy sheets, and the trail between his porch and Gwen's began to show patches of earth. It had been nearly 2 months since he'd arrived, and something had shifted, not just in the weather, but in him. He didn't notice it until he caught himself lingering at the window longer than he should, watching her haul a tarp across her garden bed, tugging it into place with a practiced flick of her wrist. He didn't call it longing, but it felt close. That evening, Gwen knocked on his door. She held a canvas wrapped in brown paper and wore a navy sweatshirt with faded letters from a state college he hadn't asked about yet. I need your opinion, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. You want my opinion on art? Alec set his book down. You know, I used to think a Rothko was a brand of vodka. She peeled back the edge of the paper. You don't need to know names. Just tell me what it makes you feel. He studied the piece in silence. It was different from the others, more restrained, but somehow heavier. A single pine tree, its branches bare, stood in the center of the frame, surrounded by a storm that seemed to press in from every side. It wasn't sad exactly, but it made his chest tighten. It feels like waiting, he said quietly. Like something's coming and you don't know if it's good or bad. Her shoulders relaxed, just a little. That's exactly what I painted. Where's it going? Denver. There's a juried show next month. I've never submitted anything that personal before. You should. It's honest. She folded the paper back over it, nodding once. Have you always painted like this? He asked. No, she said. I used to do portraits. Clean lines, predictable commissions. But after my mom died, I couldn't do faces anymore. It felt dishonest. He didn't ask about her mother. He knew the look in her eyes too well. Some griefs weren't invitations for questions. Instead, he said, you ever think about leaving the ridge? Sometimes, she admitted. But I'm not sure I'd know who I was anywhere else. Maybe that's the problem, Alec said. Places have a way of convincing us we are only one version of ourselves. She looked at him for a long moment. And what version are you trying to be here? He hesitated. I don't know yet, but it's the first time I've cared enough to ask. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of things unspoken, but not unwelcome. Eventually she said, I could use an extra set of hands tomorrow. I'm rebuilding the shed door before the spring rains hit. I've never fixed a shed door in my life. That's fine. I'll teach you. The next morning, Alec showed up wearing work gloves that still had the tag on them. Gwen handed him a hammer and pointed to the warped frame leaning against the shed. You hold, I'll drill. He crouched down as she lined up the hinge, the scent of sawdust rising between them. She worked quickly, with a quiet focus that drew him in more than anything else ever had. You ever get tired of doing everything alone? He asked without thinking. She paused, the drill still in her hand. Every day. He looked up, surprised by her honesty. But I've never trusted anyone enough to do it with me, she added, meeting his eyes. Alec didn't know what to say to that. He just held the frame steady as she finished the hinge. When the door finally swung into place, she leaned against it, brushing her hands off on her jeans. Not bad, city boy. He looked at the door, then at her. You make it easy to want to learn. That night, she came by with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine she said had been gifted to her by a visiting cousin from Oregon. They sat on his porch, the moon rising over the ridge, the bottle growing lighter with every story they traded. I used to think success was numbers, Alec said, swirling the last of his wine. Market shares, growth percentages. Now I don't even know what it means. Maybe it's just waking up and not dreading the day, Gwen said. Or not eating dinner alone. He nodded, the quiet settling around them like a blanket. Are you going back? She asked softly. To New York. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. I don't know, he said. I came here to get something done. But now every time I think about leaving, it feels like I'd be giving something up. Her gaze didn't waver. You would be. He didn't kiss her. Not then. But something passed between them, undeniable and unfinished. When she left, she paused at the bottom of the steps. You're not who I thought you'd be, she said. I'm not sure I am either. She smiled, then not with her mouth, but with something else, something deeper, and disappeared into the trees. Inside, Alec stood at the window, staring at the space she'd occupied just moments before. He wasn't sure what he'd come to the ridge looking for, but he was starting to realize what he'd found. The first real spring rain arrived at dusk, washing the ridge in a steady rhythm that tapped against Alec's windows like a quiet, persistent heartbeat. He'd been standing at the antique stove in the cabin. Halfway through chopping shallots for a risotto, he was determined to make without calling Gwen for help, when the phone buzzed. Not the landline, the cell service was still too spotty for that to matter, but the satellite phone he'd barely touched since arriving. Only 3 people had the number. One of them was his attorney. Another was his brother. He answered without thinking. Alec. The voice on the other end was clipped. His brother, Marcus. You've been off the grid for almost 3 months. The board's getting antsy. Alec wiped his hands on a towel. I told you I needed time. They're offering a buyout. Again. This time it's nearly double what we walked away from last fall. He leaned against the counter, staring at the rain. And if you're done playing lumberjack, you could fly back, renegotiate, and still come out with 20 million more than what you left with. Alec didn't answer right away. Outside, the trees swayed under the weight of the downpour. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime clinked softly, irregular but oddly calming. I said I'd stay a year, he said finally. Marcus exhaled. Is this about the money or the girl? Alec's jaw tightened. It's about me. You've built everything you have on forward motion, Alec. You don't know how to sit still. Maybe I needed to learn. There was a pause. You sound different. I am. After the call ended, Alec stood in the silence for a long time. The risotto burned. He didn't notice. The next morning, the rain had passed, but the air still held the scent of wet earth and new growth. He found Gwen near the edge of her property, kneeling beside the garden bed as she pulled back the tarp they'd secured weeks before. Her sleeves were pushed up, a dirt smudge across her cheekbone. She didn't look up when he approached. You ever think about leaving? He asked. Gwen didn't stop working. You never ask easy questions. I mean it. She sat back on her heels, brushing her hands off. Sometimes, yes. When the generator fails in the middle of a snowstorm. When I miss a gallery deadline because the road's iced over. When I remember I'm the only person under 45 for 20 miles. He crouched beside her. So why stay? Because I'm not ready to belong anywhere else. He picked up the edge of the tarp, helping her fold it. What if somewhere else isn't a city or a gallery? She glanced at him. What are you asking? He didn't answer yet. Not until the tarp was rolled and set aside. Then he stood, offered her a hand, and pulled her up. I got a call last night, he said. From my brother. There's an offer on the table, more money than I ever thought I'd walk away from. Her expression didn't change. Are you taking it? I don't know. He hesitated. But I know I don't want to leave if it means leaving you behind. Something flickered in her eyes, guarded, uncertain, but she didn't step back. You barely know me, she said. I know you paint when you can't sleep. I know you barter pies for eggs and rebuild sheds without asking for help. I know you say exactly what you mean and you walk through the world like it owes you nothing. That's not love, she said, voice quiet. No, but it's the start of something I don't want to lose. This time she didn't deflect. She didn't laugh or change the subject. I haven't let anyone in since my mom died, she said. Not really. I think I forgot how. Then let me remind you. He reached for her hand, fingers wrapping around hers with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. The wind stirred the trees around them, but neither moved. There's a gallery in Denver that offered me a residency, she said after a long pause. Just 6 weeks. Room, board, a stipend. His heart dropped. When? Next month. Are you going? I was going to say no. But now. I don't know. He nodded slowly. Then I'll wait. She blinked. You'd stay here. He smiled, a real one this time. I've got a cabin with a working stove sort of and half a roof to fix before next winter. I'll be here. Her fingers tightened around his. I don't need saving, Alec. I know, he said. I just want to be where you are. Later that afternoon, Gwen stood at the easel in her studio, the canvas in front of her blank. She dipped her brush into a pale green she hadn't used before and began with a single stroke, deliberate, certain. Across the trail, Alec was on the porch, hammer in hand, patching the roof with more determination than skill. He looked ridiculous, but he was grinning, and the sound of his laughter carried across the trees when a nail bent sideways and he cursed under his breath. That night, he lit a fire that didn't smoke. She brought over a bottle of wine she'd been saving. They sat on the floor, legs tangled, backs against the couch neither of them had bothered to fix. I'm scared, she said softly later when the flames had dimmed. Of what? Of wanting something that might not last. He took her hand, kissed the inside of her wrist. Then we make it last. However we can. She turned her head, eyes meeting his. You really think it's that simple? No, he whispered. But I think it's worth trying. The next morning a letter arrived. Not email, not a call, an actual letter, postmarked from Denver. Gwen tore it open on the porch, her breath catching as she read the first line. She'd been accepted. Full exhibit. Solo show. 6 weeks, all expenses covered. She looked across the trail. Alec was already outside, stacking firewood. He looked up and she didn't need to say anything. He grinned, wide and proud, and waved her over. I'm going, she said when she reached him. Good, he replied, pulling her into his arms. And when you come back? She lifted her chin. We figure out what's next. Together. That spring, she left for Denver with a suitcase full of canvases and a promise tucked into her back pocket. Alec stayed behind, fixing the roof, planting the garden she'd started, learning how to live without rushing toward the next deal. And when she returned 6 weeks later, with paint on her hands and stories in her eyes, he was waiting on the porch, holding a ring carved from mountain cedar and set with a single sapphire. I don't want a penthouse, he said, dropping to one knee. I don't want a boardroom. I want you. This place. A life that feels like breathing. Gwen didn't speak. She just knelt down beside him and kissed him, the trees swaying gently above them, the ridge quiet and alive. The cabin wasn't a stopover anymore. It was home. The morning Gwen returned to Aspen Ridge, she found the trail between the cabins freshly lined with smooth river stones, the kind she used to collect along the creek as a girl. She stopped at the edge of the path, her suitcase in one hand, and looked across the clearing. Alec stood on the porch, one hand braced on the railing, a soft grin tugging at his lips as if he'd been waiting there for hours. He didn't say anything, just descended the steps and took the bag from her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. You did this? She asked, glancing down at the stones. Thought you could use a welcome home, he said, brushing a leaf from her shoulder. I wasn't gone that long. It felt like forever. She didn't tell him she'd cried in the hotel room the first night or that she'd stared at her phone too many times without calling. She also didn't tell him that when the gallery director asked what inspired her work, she'd said, a man who taught me that quiet doesn't mean empty. Instead, she let him take her hand and lead her to the porch swing he'd finally repaired. I kept it from collapsing, he said as they Saturday mostly. She tilted her head toward him. What else did you do while I was gone? I replaced the roof, fixed the chimney cap, and learned that squirrels don't take kindly to eviction. And the ring. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out again, the same carved cedar band with the sapphire, polished now, the wood sealed clean and smooth. I had it finished while you were in Denver. Took it to a place in town. Told them it was for someone stubborn, brilliant, and impossible to forget. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at it, then at him. Ask me again, she whispered. He slid off the swing and knelt on the porch, both hands steady this time. Gwen Hale, will you marry me? She bent down and kissed him, long and certain, the scent of rain still lingering in her hair. Yes. They didn't plan the wedding right away. Instead, spring settled in around them, slow and golden, the kind of season that felt earned. Gwen painted more than ever, though with a new sense of light in her strokes, her canvases blooming with color that hadn't existed before. Alec spent more time in the woods than online, clearing trails, repairing old fence posts, learning how to live without always needing to conquer something. One afternoon in early summer, Gwen returned from town with a set of keys and a folded brochure in her bag. She found Alec out back, sanding down the old bench they'd talked about turning into a trellis. There's a space opening in the village square, she said, dropping the keys into his palm. Old bakery closed down. I'm thinking a gallery. Maybe one room for my work, one for others. Maybe even a studio. He turned the keys over in his hand, then looked up at her. You're staying. I was always staying. I just had to figure out what that looked like. He reached for her hand, dusty with sawdust and summer heat. Do I get a room in the back to hide when tourists come in? Only if you stop calling them tourists. They're customers now. He laughed, then pulled her in, his arms wrapping around her waist. Promise me we'll never go back to who we were before this, she whispered into his shoulder. I can't, he said. Because we're never going to be those people again. We outgrew them. The wedding was small, just the way they wanted it. Gwen wore a dress she'd sewn herself, hemmed with lace from her mother's trunk. Alec stood beside her in a shirt rolled at the sleeves, no tie, his hair longer than it had been in years. They exchanged vows beneath the archway of the same trees that had stood witness to every quiet moment between them. The crowd was scattered, neighbors from the Ridge, a few artists from Gwen's Denver show, Alec's brother Marcus, who arrived in a rented SUV and spent most of the reception marveling at how his younger brother looked 10 years younger than he had in Manhattan. Afterward, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, shoes in one hand, Gwen's bouquet in the other. Inside, the fire was already lit, not for warmth, but for the soft light that danced across the walls. Alec poured 2 glasses of wine from the bottle Gwen had stashed months earlier, the one she said she'd only open when everything felt exactly right. They sat on the floor, backs against the couch, fingers laced. What happens tomorrow, she asked. Breakfast on the porch. Then maybe we stain the new window frames. She smiled, her head resting on his shoulder. You think we'll ever miss the city? Maybe the bagels. She laughed, and he pressed a kiss into her temple. But I wouldn't trade a single morning on this ridge for all the penthouses in Manhattan. They didn't say anything else that night. They didn't need to. As the fire crackled low, the rain began again, not heavy, just a soft misting that tapped against the roof like a lullaby. Alec pulled the blanket closer around them, Gwen's hand tucked against his chest, her breathing even and warm. The cabin no longer smelled like dust or disuse. It smelled like paint and pine and something new, a life neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. And in that quiet, surrounded by the trees and the steadiness of each other, they knew they'd finally arrived. Home. Forever.